Thank you everyone for coming. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Tim Ginty. I'll be your MC today. I'm the Trade Justice Campaigner here at AFTINET. But first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we're joining from all across this country on lands of Indigenous people. And I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nations. But we're all coming from across the whole continent from Indigenous lands. And we would like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And welcome everyone tonight, whether you're AFTINET members or supporters or whether you're completely new to the trade justice movement. Thanks so much for coming and learning about these important issues in this election context. We've got around 65 people registered today, so thank you all so much for coming, and no doubt we'll have others join through the event. We're here to discuss a trade justice agenda for the next term of Parliament. We'll be looking at how trade deals can help or hinder the nation as it recovers from COVID-19 pandemic and also as it tackles climate change and reduces carbon emissions. So our speakers will be looking at what they think needs to be included, excluded, or changed from trade deals and the whole trade process. So we've got a really great lineup of speakers today. We have Dr. Patricia Ranald, the AFTINET convener, and she's also an Honorary Research Associate at the Sydney University. We have Dr. Deborah Gleeson from the Latrobe University and also the Public Health Association of Australia. We have Matthew Rose, the Economy and Democracy Program Manager at the Australian Conservation Foundation, or the ACF, and Steve Murphy, the National Secretary of the AMWU, the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union. So no doubt we're all very keen to hear from our speakers, so we'll get right into the discussion. First of all, they'll give a kind of in-depth analysis of how they see the issue before we move on to a Q&A session at the end. So if you do have any questions, just pop them into the chat box and I can come back to that in the Q&A section. And just a reminder to everyone to mute your microphones because we're in a meeting format and we can see and hear everything. Our first speaker is Dr. Patricia Ranald, the convener of AFTINET, who's going to talk about our trade justice scorecard, but also about how we can improve trade transparency. So over to you, Pat.
Thanks. Can everyone see the screen? I'm going to give an overview of trade policy and COVID recovery, climate change, and the election. So first of all, I want to talk about the claims and realities of trade deals. So whether they're bilateral like the one we have with Singapore or regional like the TPP agreement that Australia and 10 other Pacific Rim countries are involved in, or multilateral like the World Trade Organization with 164 members, trade deals share certain assumptions. And they are that each economy should specialise in its most competitive products and import everything else. There should be no local industry development policy. There should be zero tariffs and zero other regulatory barriers to trade and investment in all goods and services. And the aim is to freeze and then reduce both tariffs and regulation of services. It assumes that increased global competition delivers benefits for all and ignores local industry and employment impacts and health, labour rights, environmental impacts, including climate change. So this can contribute to a race to the bottom on standards and increased global inequality. Global corporations are very much in command in this process, and they lobby government for trade and investment rules to suit them. And some deals have actually increased corporate rights provisions like stronger monopolies on medicines and rights to sue governments over law and policy changes. If we look at the actual impacts of trade deals, the most obvious is that it has led to an overdependence on imports, as we learnt during the pandemic. Governments had to actually act against these trade rules to assist production of things like masks, ventilators and vaccines when imports stopped. Medicine monopolies delay access to cheaper medicines, so that the WTO, for example, the World Trade Organization, has rules for monopolies on medicines, and there's been a huge debate about the refusal of some governments to agree to waive those monopolies during the pandemic to enable poorer countries to get access to medicines. They also can restrict future regulation of essential services unless they're specifically excluded. And we've had the debate here about the recommendations of the Royal Commission on Aged Care, because it wasn't clear that aged care was specifically excluded from recent provisions in trade agreements. And that meant that the increase in regulation required by those recommendations could bump up against the rules of the trade agreement. They also give corporations special rights to sue governments for millions or even billions of dollars if a change in law or policy harms their investment, known as Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS. And you've probably heard of the Philip Morris Tobacco Company suing Australia over our plain packaging law. And there have been many cases against environmental regulation, which we'll hear more about later. In Australia, recent trade agreements have also increased the numbers of vulnerable temporary workers tied to one employer without effective workers' rights at the expense of permanent migration. And most trade deals don't have enforceable rights or commitments on human rights, labour rights, or environmental standards, including combating climate change. So what do we mean by trade justice? What are our goals in relation to trade? Well, trade can improve people's lives, and trade deals should help, not hinder, things like the COVID recovery, local employment, and the transition to low carbon industries. So in a very summary form, what we're saying is that we need to exclude certain things from trade agreements. We need to exclude overly restrictive rules on local industry development. We need to exclude medicine monopolies on COVID-related vaccines and treatments. We need to exclude corporate rights to sue governments over changes in law or policy and increases in vulnerable temporary workers. And what we actually want to include in trade agreements are things like the temporary waiver on WTO monopolies on COVID vaccines and treatments, more flexible industry development policies, fully enforceable labour rights and environmental standards. And our other speakers today are going to address these in more detail. I'm going to talk just a little bit more detail about the trade agreement process, which is secretive and lacks democratic accountability. Now, all the issues I've discussed above should really be decided through the normal democratic parliamentary process. But when they appear in trade deals, they're subject to secret negotiations. There's no publication of the text before it's signed, and we don't see the deal until after it's been done. There's no independent evaluation of the economic, employment, health, environment, or gender impacts. It's reviewed by a parliamentary committee, but that committee can't change the text, and there's no parliamentary vote on the whole agreement, only the enabling legislation. So what we want is meaningful changes to this. We want meaningful community consultations during negotiations and publications of negotiating texts. We want publication of final agreed text before signing. We want independent evaluation of economic and social impacts before signing, and we want meaningful parliamentary review. Now, those, the first three are already being done in the EU, and the meaningful parliamentary review and the vote by Parliament on the whole agreement, not just the enabling legislation, already occurs in the EU and the US. Now, what we've done for this election is produced a scorecard which assesses trade policies for trade justice against trade justice criteria. It's based on the voting record and public statements of the main parties on key issues and on their policies on the trade agreement process. We're not trying to tell people how to vote, but the assessment allows them to see the how they match up to criteria of trade justice. And I'll just get the scorecard up. I'll go very briefly through it. It covers issues like the temporary waiver on medicines, investor right to sue governments, regulation and deregulation of essential services, labour rights in trade deals, environmental protections in trade deals, supporting or rather making sure there's not increases in numbers of temporary workers who are vulnerable to exploitation. And on the process, it supports independent evaluation of trade agreements, the draft and final text being released before signing, and the final thing we assessed them on was their voting record on actual trade agreements that have been voted on in the Parliament. You can see that there's the actual scorecard there. I'll just go back to sharing. Sorry. I'm having trouble getting out of this, so
we can now see the slideshow.
Can you? Oh, good.
Yeah, that's what we're seeing here. Yep.
Oh, good. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so as you can see from that, the Liberal National government has the lowest score. So if they're elected, we're going to expect more of the same. Labor has a higher score on its policy platform, but they haven't voted against deals with ISDS and other bad provisions. They have said that in government, they will not sign such deals and they will review other deals with those provisions, but they'll need to be held accountable to implement those policies if they actually win government. The Greens have the highest score on both issues and their voting against bad trade deals. And the Centre Alliance Rex Patrick group have good scores on those issues on which they have acted or made statements, and they have voted against bad trade deals. So we hope that's helpful to people, and you can look at it in more detail. It has more explanation when you actually look at it for yourselves. There's an explanation of how we arrived at those, the evidence that we've used for that. So I'll finish by saying that this is just some information about AFTINET. You can support our current campaigns on which are listed there, and you can get, there's also the link to the scorecard, and we are providing questions that people can ask candidates specifically about the trade process, either by email or through using those questions at candidate meetings. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Pat.
Sharing.
That's great. And I'm sure we'll have some questions later on in the Q&A. So just reminding everyone that if you do have a question, just pop it in that chat box and I'll come back to that. Just moving on to our next speaker, we have Steve Murphy from the AMWU. So Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. I'll start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of land on which we all meet together virtually and pay respects to elders past and present. I also reconfirm the AMW's commitment to the Uluru Statement from the Heart and acknowledge that there's a lot more work that we've got to do in delivering justice for First Nation people. I want to start by saying thank you to Pat and Tim for inviting me along to participate today in this forum, and of course to all of our AFTINET affiliates and supporters that keep it going and keep trade as an election and a political issue, and of course all of the attendees that are here today to listen and to participate on this particular topic. For those that don't know me, I'm Steve Murphy. I'm the National Secretary of the AMWU. I started my working life as a metal worker up in Newcastle, and I was soon recruited as a union activist after I got involved in the union at my workplace. And my interest in the impacts of trade or free trade deals, as they were called, it first piqued my interest when I was an AMW organiser for the union back in about 2004. I was instructed by our then National Secretary, Doug Cameron, to go out and hold mass meetings about the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement, and that was about to be signed. And he told all of us about the importance or the need to go out and hold meetings with workers and to get them active in opposing that deal in its form that it was being negotiated. And to make sure that I didn't, for lack of a better word, embarrass myself, and to be able to answer any questions that our members might have had, I took some time to read as much detail as I possibly could about the deal Australia was intending to sign. And it wasn't easy to find that detail, of course, but as you went deeper into it, I also learned a little bit about Australia's trade record and our approach, but mostly it was reading about the direct impact on secure jobs and our self-sufficiency as a nation. And this was the beginning of my commitment to using whatever role I had to fight for a more progressive and fair trade agenda for Australia. So Pat's asked me to come along and just talk briefly today about how we could reshape trade negotiations and agreements to support rather than harm local jobs and workplace rights. And I don't think anyone here is ignorant to the consequences of Australia's very narrow trade agenda that we've had for 30 plus years. It's a record of decades of free trade agreements, and it's nothing close to what we were promised, which was a better quality of life and a significant decrease in the cost of living, and the promise of eliminating poverty. We've seen good, decent regional jobs sent offshore, and really our sovereignty and our capability being compromised just so that you can buy some cheaper white goods by exploited foreign labour. It's a well-versed statement, but I think it's worth repeating now. Our current trading framework only acts as a profit enhancer for private capital. Our democratically elected governments profit enhancers for private capital. Sometimes we become really desensitized to many of the world's injustices, but when you take a moment to sit back and reflect on how we engage in trade, I think it's only right that we would be angry about that. The thing is, though, it doesn't have to be that way. Trade doesn't have to be a race to the bottom where those deliberate decisions were made by our leaders to frame it that way. Trade could have been a really good thing for labour standards, but workers and the community were never given a seat at the table. And of course, there's a lot at stake at this federal election. And I think we hear that every 3 years. But what's different this time is that there's something different and something big about this, not just for those people who follow politics. The last 3 years has really sucked a lot of the optimism and promise out of our kind of psyche as a nation. And we've been so ground down that our ambitions for the future of our country have been shrunk. We're only expecting bread now and roses. And I know and thank AFTINET for developing this scorecard of the major parties on their commitments around trade. And it's not a shock to me or probably anyone here about the LNP or the Liberal Party scored very poorly. What might surprise people is that the ALP scored quite high. And that is despite a questionable record on trade over many, many decades. And this score doesn't come by accident, of course, or some moment of goodwill by the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party. It came from long-term strategic activism inside the party, by AFTINET, by activists and like-minded unions. And our campaign inside of the party came from a vision of reshaping trade as an opportunity to drive social progress in our region and build consensus about our economy domestically. And together, when that moment was right, we leveraged that support internally and externally around the party to change the party's platform back in 2019 for the better. So after screaming into the void about these issues for such a long, long time, it can be difficult to reimagine how trade could be used as something that is for the social good, rather than simply asking for concessions in what is inherently an exploitative process of business being able to move their investments and their profits to the low wage countries and to the lowest taxing areas. But the bare minimum has to be robust labour standards, a seat at the table for workers and community, and a much more transparent and process, but scrutiny of these deals about whether or not it is actually in the national interest to sign them. We know that Labor is committed to a decent trade process when they're in government, and that includes detailed and proper market testing for any labour requirements, good protections for our healthcare system and PBS and public services, and they've made it clear they're going to have a more focused on a holistic national approach test before signing agreements into the future. But those wins really only tinker around the edges and don't go to the heart of the big issue around the way that we negotiate these agreements. We've got to be fighting to make sure that our trade agenda is intimately tied to our vision for national development. We've got a massive opportunity in front of us right now with the shift in our energy needs to be able to pick up renewables. They're going to picking up pace at an exponential level now as not just an emerging but a dominant industry force. And we've also got some strategic global advantage around those renewables, and we can use that to not only grow good, secure jobs here, but to deliver social good inside our country, but beyond our borders into our region. And it would be a remarkable achievement to see trade agreements commit to ILO standards as a minimum working condition, so we could start to remove wages from global competition and use our strategic leverage to lift workers around the world out of poverty. And it doesn't just have to be about workplace rights. There's nothing stopping us from putting on the table that things like literacy and numeracy targets or health and wellbeing targets are on the table when we're doing these kinds of agreements with countries in our region. And these kinds of examples are just some of what we could achieve if we just step outside that narrow casting of what free trade agreements have been framed by those people, but framed by those people whose interests are currently being served by it. So thanks to our collective efforts, we're on the precipice of a framework that could deliver agreements that walk away from a race to the bottom approach and walk towards lifting millions of working class families' lives and livelihoods. And as we know, with most social progress, it's ours to win, but more importantly, it's ours to defend it. And securing a commitment is only half the story for us. We've got to be united in its implementation and united in its ongoing improvement. The good thing for us is that AFTINET boasts a significant and diverse group of member organisations. And if we do see a change in government at the election, then AFTINET will be that critical meeting place for our organisations to see our years of work and effort and commitment come into fruition. So thank you all for taking the time to have this important discussion today, and I look forward to the other presenters and to the questions. Thank you, Pat, and thank you, Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That was really interesting. Thanks for sharing that story of how you got involved in trade justice activism nearly 20 years ago now with the US trade deal. Our next speaker is who's up next? We have Dr. Deborah Gleeson. Deb is from the Public Health Association of Australia, and she's also at the Latrobe University. So thanks, Deb. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Tim, and thanks for everyone for having me along today. I'll just share my slides. Can you see one slide there on the screen? Tim, can you just confirm for me?
Yep, that's right. We can perfectly see it.
Yep. Okay, great. Hang on. I haven't got the slideshow on. Okay, hopefully you can see the slideshow. All right, so I'm going to talk about global vaccine equity, trade rules and the pandemic, and I'm going to make the case for a waiver of the certain provisions in the World Trade Organization's TRIPS agreement that apply to COVID-19 health products and technologies. So just before I jump in, like the other speakers, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I'm sitting. That's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Slideshow's not working for me. Okay, let me just try again. Sorry about this.
Yep, we can see that again. Yep.
You can see the slideshow view?
Yep, yep.
Okay. All right. Oh, yes. Okay.
There we go.
Great. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about global vaccine inequity to start off with and show you a few pictures. I'll talk about the causes of global vaccine equity and some of the potential solutions, focusing particularly on waiving intellectual property rights. So the conditions for inequitable access to COVID-19 vaccines were set early in the pandemic. And many of you would remember that by November 2020, although we had several vaccines becoming available to prevent COVID-19, rich countries very quickly snapped up the bulk of the global supply. So by November 2020, countries accounting for only 14% of the global population had already purchased more than 51% of the first 7.5 billion doses, many of which had not been manufactured by that point. But by yesterday, almost 11.7 billion doses have been administered around the world, but a third of the global population hasn't received a dose yet. And in low-income countries, it's less than 16% of the populations of those countries. So we're well past 2 years into the pandemic now. We've had vaccines available for a long time, but we've still got a vastly inequitable distribution of those vaccines. And although we are getting more and more vaccines becoming available all the time, we're likely in the future to need vaccines that are specific to certain variants, or pan-coronavirus vaccines that can prevent the effects of a range of different variants of the virus, and also vaccines that can actually better prevent transmission than the vaccines that we have at the moment. So we're likely to see these same patterns of inequity reproducing themselves as we move forward in the pandemic, without even having solved the initial inequitable distribution from the beginning. As well as inequitable access to vaccines, we also have vast inequities in access to treatments for COVID-19, particularly the new oral antiviral treatments like Paxlovid and Molnupiravir, which are now becoming available, and also diagnostic tests. So when we look at the case numbers around the world, we know that although we're not seeing very high case numbers in some low and middle income countries at the moment, those low case numbers are because there's not much testing going on. And if we're not testing, we're not managing the pandemic, and we're also not being able to get treatments to people who need them. So these are big problems that are going to stay with us unless we come up with really workable solutions to solving them. So many of you will be familiar with maps like this that really bring home the statistics and the inequitable distribution. So this is the share of people who received at least one dose of COVID-19 vaccine by the 10th of May this year. So you can see Africa in particular has a very low vaccination rate so far, and it's an absolute disgrace that 2 years into the pandemic we haven't managed to get enough vaccines to these low income countries. And here's another graph that really shows the very wide gap between the vaccination rates in upper middle income countries and high income countries, lower middle income countries around the middle there, and low income countries right at the bottom of the graph. And you can see that while we've made some progress in getting more vaccines to those low income and lower middle income countries, we're not narrowing that gap significantly over time. So this graph just shows you, dates back to November 2020, and how many wealthy countries, Australia included, had pre-purchased way more vaccine doses than they actually needed. So this comes from an article in the British Medical Journal and shows the number of courses of vaccines per capita that Canada and Australia and other countries had purchased. So at that time, Australia had pre-purchased enough to vaccinate our population 3 times over. It's much worse now. This is a very busy slide, so don't worry about all the detail. But Australia so far has ordered 280.8 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines for us, which equates to 10.8 doses per person, and we've invested $8 billion in purchasing those vaccines. On the other side of the slide, we've got our donations through COVAX, $130 million so far, and another $85 million pledged, 10 million doses pledged through COVAX recently. And we have made some bilateral commitments for donating vaccines where we've promised $523 billion to a regional vaccine initiative, another 100 million through a quad vaccine partnership, and 60 million doses to other countries in the region. So far, only 32 million of those doses have yet been dispersed, and you can see in some very needy countries like Papua New Guinea, only 250,000 doses have been delivered so far. So still a long way to go, even in terms of vaccine donations. And of course, vaccine donations will only go so far to bridge the huge gaps that I've shown you on the previous slides. What we really need is more manufacturing of vaccines in low and middle income countries. We need to equip countries to be able to make their own vaccines, diagnostics, treatments, and to really ramp up the global supply and to be able to get it to where it's needed a lot faster than we are right at the moment. So COVAX, which was set up in 2020 and was meant to provide the equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines, has really been quite a phenomenal failure. So it initially started with a modest aim to deliver 2 billion doses by the end of 2021, which would only be 20% of the population of countries, so health workers and other vulnerable groups. That forecast was wound back to 1.4 billion in September last year, and now we're only up to just under 1.5 billion, so lagging really severely behind because of lack of funds, lack of doses going through COVAX, and the fact that wealthy countries are buying up the bulk of the supply. So one of the big factors that's sitting behind this picture is the intellectual property barriers that protect the monopolies that a handful of companies have for these vaccines and other COVID-19 products. And those monopolies are protected by trade agreements, in particular the World Trade Organization's TRIPS agreement, the agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. There's no quiz at the end of this presentation, so you don't need to remember the name of it. So the TRIPS agreement requires WTO members, 164 members of the WTO, to provide minimum standards of intellectual property protection, which include patents on pharmaceutical products and processes of at least 20 years, and a slew of other intellectual property protections, things like copyright, trademarks, geographical indications, and so on. And one that's particularly important for COVID-19 vaccines is the undisclosed information about the manufacturing process that we know companies need to be able to access to be able to make copies of a vaccine. Now, the TRIPS agreement does have some safeguards. It allows for what we call compulsory licenses that enable governments to actually bypass patents in circumstances like an emergency to be able to provide access to medicines. But these safeguards are actually very difficult to use. They're time consuming and not suitable for circumstances like a pandemic where you need to urgently roll out large numbers of products in lots of countries all at the same time. So the TRIPS agreement is a significant barrier to ramping up the global supply and increasing manufacturing in low and middle income country contexts. So one example of the way that intellectual property prevents the getting products to where they're needed is the example of remdesivir. And this case study comes from a chapter in a book that's just coming out this month called Global Health Watch 6 in the Shadow of the Pandemic. And it's a chapter that I wrote with Kapuri Gopakumar. So Gilead Sciences owns patents in more than 70 countries for this treatment for COVID-19. And they set the price for a 5-day course of treatment at around $2,500 US. This is for a drug that costs about $1 a day to actually make. The development of this drug was underpinned by large amounts of public funding, but Gilead still controls the access to this drug. And although Gilead agreed to compulsory licenses with some countries, some low and middle income countries, it restricts which countries can actually buy those cheaper versions of the drug. So it's only 127 mainly low income countries. And of course, the US government bought up most of the first 3 months supply. So this was an early case study from earlier in the pandemic. And we're seeing this same sort of scenario now happen with the drugs that are more recently coming onto the market. So a big chunk of the world's population can't buy the cheaper products that are being made in the third world, and they can't afford the expensive versions that are being made in the US and other wealthy countries. So back in 2020, 18 months ago now, India and South Africa put a proposal to the World Trade Organization to waive the provisions in the TRIPS agreement that present barriers to the manufacturing of COVID-19 medical products. So not just vaccines, but also treatments, diagnostics, medical devices, and personal protective equipment like masks and ventilators and so on. And not only the products themselves, but everything that goes into making them. So this was quite a broad ranging waiver, and it would also apply to all of the provisions, all of the TRIPS rules that present barriers to the manufacturing of these products, and it would last for at least 3 years from the date of decision. 18 months later, we don't even have a decision yet, and there's a compromise that's on the table being discussed at the WTO because wealthy countries have refused to support this waiver, have dragged their feet, and we now have a compromise that's emerged from discussions between the EU, the US, India and South Africa. However, nobody's happy with this compromise. No one wants to own it. The Director General of the World Trade Organization is trying to, to generate some consensus around this, this very flawed compromise, but it only applies to vaccines, not treatments and tests, which is very short-sighted, and there wouldn't be a decision for at least 6 months about treatments and tests. It only applies to a subset of intellectual property rules, in particular patents, and it doesn't do anything about freeing up the undisclosed information about the manufacturing process, which we know is vitally important for making vaccines. It only applies to some developing countries, and instead of waiving a lot of the requirements, the strict rules in the TRIPS agreement, it actually only waives a few of them and introduces a whole lot of new complexities that mean that it won't necessarily be very effective even in this narrow area of vaccine patents. So a lot of access to medicines advocates and legal experts think this could actually be worse than nothing. It actually is not going to help in any meaningful way to bring these products out more quickly. Now, Australia earlier on wasn't supporting the TRIPS waiver. In about September last year, Australia shifted its position to one of publicly stating that it supported the waiver, but Australia seems to be supporting some consensus around the waiver rather than insisting on something that's really meaningful and transformative. So our concerns are that although Australia says, yes, yes, we support the waiver, that support is not actually going to help necessarily move us in the direction that we need to be able to address these access barriers. So just to wind up, the TRIPS waiver is a really important initiative that's been languishing for far too long at the global level. If we could pass a waiver that reflects what India and South Africa were initially asking for, companies would be able to freely produce all of these health products and technologies without fear of litigation over IP infringement. And it would also provide some leverage to force the pharmaceutical industry to cooperate towards other solutions, because so far they've really refused to come to the table and negotiate over other workable arrangements. Of course, the TRIPS waiver isn't enough on its own. We need to increase donations of both funds and products. We need to put pressure on pharmaceutical companies to share their intellectual property and technology and know-how. And we also need greater investment in manufacturing capacity in low and middle income country contexts. That's all for me, but I look forward to the questions. And I noticed John had a few interesting questions earlier on, so please keep feeding those questions through. Look forward to the chat later on. Thanks very much, Tim. Back to you.
Thanks to you, Deb. That was great. Thanks for the update on that campaign, and thanks for all your work over the past couple of years on this campaign. It's been fantastic. Our next speaker today is Matthew Rose from the Australian Conservation Foundation. He's the Economy and Democracy Program Manager there. And Matthew, he's going to look at how trade agreements can help us or hinder us on our road to a low carbon economy or zero carbon economy. Over to you, Matthew.
Thanks, Tim. And I'll just share my screen. So hopefully everyone will be able to see that. Can people see that all right?
Yep.
Great. I also want to start by acknowledging the Indigenous people of Australia. I'm on Wurundjeri land here in Melbourne, and I just wanted to note that sovereignty was never ceded and a treaty has never been signed, and the struggle for Indigenous justice continues. I want to kind of set up what I'm going to say by saying that, as many of you know, the energy transition is very much underway across the world. And in a sense, some of these trade agreements are both about accelerating what's happening, but also in a big sense, kind of getting out of the way. And so I'll start with the parts of trade agreements and kind of with some examples that are kind of hindering the energy transition that needs to happen and is underway. And research came out last week actually saying that the investor-state dispute settlement procedures are actually putting at risk about $340 billion in legal and financial risks over some fossil fuel projects across the world. So there's that amount of money is at risk if countries essentially who are liable for ISDS provisions start cancelling or moving away from their fossil fuel projects. And that includes over kind of 10,000 oil and gas projects that are in very early stages of development. These 10,000 of these projects are covered by ISDS. And these are projects that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the International Energy Agency have said can't go ahead if we're going to achieve even just a 2-degree warming world. So ISDS is really hindering this transition because it puts these risks on top of governments who want to move away, but who are being held back by a number of things, including ISDS in their trade agreements. I want to talk very quickly about the Keystone XL pipeline, which was a pipeline that was running from Canada through the US to the Gulf of Mexico, or was planned to. A big energy project that there was lots of opposition to, that President Biden cancelled as one of his first acts in office. That this was subject to ISDS. TC Energy, who are the proponents, are suing the US government for $15 billion under ISDS provisions. And I think it's a really useful example because it was a very high-profile case. It's a US government. They can afford to pay this type of money. There were big campaigns across the world, across environment, Indigenous groups to try and get the project cancelled or the permits cancelled for the pipeline. that was successful. But it's not a position that a lot of countries around the world can put themselves in. They can't put up $15 billion or billions of dollars to cancel these projects. They're also not necessarily subject to the same kind of campaigns that the US government was in this project. So it's a big problem if ISDS is holding back transition and helping, I guess, increase the risk for governments to withdraw from these type of projects or withdraw permissions from these type of projects. The ISDS has been even called out in the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change sixth assessment report. It identified ISDS as a problem, as something that is helping to block international cooperation and the accelerated transition. So it's clear that people in the climate space are recognizing this as one of the many issues, but a big issue that is kind of tying the hands of government. We know that the fossil fuel industry across the world fights dirty and will grab onto anything that they can to slow down this transition. And ISDS is something they're definitely looking into and definitely interested in, and definitely something that they're reminding governments about as they're lobbying them when governments are thinking about either withdrawing permits or not allowing certain things to go ahead. So that's kind of that's the hindrance for climate. I think what I've kind of grabbed as the help is things that are helping is this new push, and it's a push especially in the European Union for this thing called carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And they're basically saying that the EU is saying that if they impose climate policies or a carbon price, that goods, to level the playing field for goods that are being imported into the EU, then a price will be imposed on the countries who aren't imposing similar standards or carbon prices on the goods that are being exported. So I think something like that really focuses the minds of countries across the world when a big trading bloc like the EU starts talking about these things. And it's not in place and it's still being talked about. But it's something that exporters notice, and even agricultural exporters here in Australia are talking about it as a thing, and industry in Australia is talking about it here. They recognise that there's a possibility that it's coming down the line, and so it's kind of changing the way they think about their environmental activities. And this also plays into the EU-Australia Free Trade Agreement. So when the negotiations for the agreement were kicking off in 2018 and 19, members of the European Parliament were getting up and they were saying, we shouldn't be signing a free trade agreement with a country like Australia that's not honouring its climate commitments. And so I think how strictly the environmental standards are put into the agreements, which we're in favour of, even if they're not strictly in the agreement, we think that the higher climate commitments from the Australian government can be leveraged out of trade agreements and trading blocs like the EU saying you have to raise your standards before we sign an agreement. We think it kind of accelerates it. It'd be useful to have enforceable commitments in there that say certain things happen if you don't meet those commitments, but even international pressure around trade and around agreements and linking the two together is really important. I want to talk also about the Energy Charter Treaty, which is a treaty that many of the ISDS agreements for the fossil fuel industries that exist now fall under. I think the research that I was talking about last week said 6 or 7% of all kind of fossil fuel agreements they looked at fall under this charter. And this is a kind of an old charter that was designed when the fossil fuel industry was, I guess, kind of our only form of energy and was about protecting fossil fuel investments. And this treaty is undergoing some modernisation negotiations at the moment, which are really important. The EU is leading that. Most of the members of the Energy Charter Treaty are EU members, so the EU has a lot of power. And I think the EU has recognised through recent other trade agreements it's been negotiating that the ISDS provisions are a big problem, and that there also needs to be a right for governments to regulate in the way that they see fit for their citizens and their economies and their countries. So I think that through that treaty, there's a big push to phase out the rights of the fossil fuel industry to ISDS provisions. I noticed that they're talking about phasing out the rights of coal investors before they phase out the rights of gas and oil investors, which is interesting, but it's kind of a recognition of the transition that we're on. So I think it's really, really important. So I think hopefully that modernisation process with that treaty gets us to a good place on fossil fuels, and the EU is able to kind of use their power through other agreements they're negotiating to make sure that ISDS provisions allow for governments to transition out of fossil fuels as quickly as we need to. So I guess just in summing up, the signals that trade agreements can provide, and that through negotiations, even if there aren't commitments directly in trade agreements, is really, really important. We would like to see more enforceable commitments on climate change and on nature, which is a whole other thing I could talk about for another 10 minutes, but I won't, on the way nature is being protected or not protected through trade agreements. So I think there's a real important connection, and we're hoping to see in the next few years, and hopefully with a changing government, a recognition that action on climate change can go along with a good trade policy. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Matt. That was great. I know you were mentioning the Energy Charter Treaty. I know our European colleagues, they're really ramping up their campaign over there against, to get rid of ISDS in that agreement. So we'll be watching that pretty closely too. So now we're at 1:25. Now our meeting's scheduled to end at 1:30, but I mean, perhaps if we could take another couple minutes to get to some questions. I mean, everyone's welcome to log off whenever they can, but if you have any questions, just send them through the chat box. We've had some come in over the course of the meeting, but you can send any through now. The first question, I think this question can be for perhaps Pat. We've had several questions about the Greens and this person thinks it's important to vote Greens to get some change on trade and other issues as well. Perhaps, Pat, could you talk to how you assess the Greens in the scorecard and what your conclusion is there? You're just on mute, Pat. Yeah.
Yes, the scorecard's not designed to tell people how to vote, but to show them what the parties are saying and then make their own assessment. And because we're a network, we talk to all the parties, and so we don't sort of favour one over the other, but we do try and assess them honestly. The scorecard shows that the Greens have the best score, and that Labor have the next best score. Then the in terms of the parliamentary parties, the Centre Alliance and the Liberals are a long way behind all of the others. So I guess what I'm saying is that according to our scorecards, the Greens have the best score, but it's up to you to make your assessment of who you vote for.
Yep, thanks, Pat. And I had a question, perhaps do we still have Steve?
No, Steve had to leave the meeting.
Oh, okay. Well, perhaps this one's another one for you, Pat, in the absence of Steve. So there's a lot of talk coming out about the US's new approach to trade in the Pacific, especially. They're talking about a worker-centered approach to trade. What's your thoughts on this? Is it a real, new approach, and could it help us at Australia push for a different direction here with a potential new government?
I think this initiative it's the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum that it's really just starting up. I think they're going to announce it in the next week or so, the next couple of weeks. The problem with this initiative is that it's a kind of geopolitical initiative. It's the US plus some countries in Southeast Asia, plus Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and India. And it's kind of those who are in a strategic alliance with the US. It's not going to be a binding trade agreement. It's more like a sort of forum with common objectives. But the US is saying that one of their objectives is to have labour rights and environmental standards agreed by the members of this forum, but it's not going to be legally binding. So I think it's a bit early to say whether it's going to make any real difference, because I do think it's driven as much by the strategic competition with China in the region as it is by a kind of realistic attempt to get it's certainly not going to be about legally binding provisions. At best, it will be about aspirational discussion. In that sense, it's good to have that discussion going on about labour rights and environmental standards, but it's not clear whether it's going to lead to anything very concrete yet.
Yep. And a question for Deb. You've been in discussions with the government, ministers, representatives of DFAT, and politicians from, I think, from other parties perhaps. How would you assess and judge the positions of each of the parties, the LNP, the ALP, the Greens?
Well, I think that, the position of the current government is very much, as I said, one of, saying that they support the waiver, but what they're really aiming for is something that, will represent a compromise that can reach consensus, rather than saying we really need a meaningful waiver. I think that the Labor Party's position is much more that they want to see meaningful change. Of course, how that would actually play out if they win the election remains to be seen. And I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the position of the Greens are, but I think Pat probably has more up-to-date information about the positions of the different political parties. So perhaps I could ask Pat to comment.
Yeah, the Greens, like Labor, said at the time that they not only supported the waiver, but they thought the Australian government should actually sponsor the full original waiver. So both Labor and the Greens have said that. And if there is a change of government, I think that means that there will certainly be, if they live up to that commitment, they would be, and we would be pressuring them to take a much stronger position for a full comprehensive waiver rather than what's being discussed at the moment. The Centre Alliance haven't said anything about the waiver.
Yeah. And a question on the theme of environment and trade. We've had, obviously, we're looking at horror at the conflict in Europe between Ukraine and Russia. There's an upheaval in the energy markets, particularly with oil and gas imports from Russia. Is there potential for this, now this conflict over energy, to cause ISDS claims against European countries, and will that affect their transition away from Russian fossil fuels? Perhaps Matt or Pat?
That's a very good question. I would hope that kind of emergency settings that the governments are talking about in terms of transitioning away from Russian gas and oil wouldn't involve IS. That they've indemnified or found a way around it, but I'm not sure. I would imagine that any company that tried to sue a European government at the moment who's trying to transition away from Russian oil and gas would probably ruin their reputation. So that might be holding things back, unless there's other legal avenues I'm not aware of.
I might just add there that the Russians have actually withdrawn from the Energy Charter Treaty because they got sued over some contract issues since the 90s. And so I think it depends whether there is a grandfather clause that a Russian company could actually use. The grandfather clause is when you withdraw from the treaty, but the treaty still applies for another 5 or 10 years. Yeah, that's an interesting curly question. It's interesting that Russia has withdrawn from the Energy Charter Treaty because of the problems it experienced in being sued.
Yep. Okay, thank you. And perhaps one more question on the topic of COVID and trade. Deb, I know you've been writing recently about, the continuing cases in Australia and deaths because of COVID. There was a question before about, us in Australia, while a lot of us think, okay, we've got the vaccines now, we're all safe, but the idea of we're not even safe here until the whole planet is safe from COVID. Perhaps you could speak to that in the current context.
Thanks, Tim. That's a really good question. I think, so far we've seen a new variant emerging about every 6 months during the pandemic, and a new variant that's caused massive upheaval and new waves of infection. And the last 2 variants have both come from low and middle income countries with inadequate vaccination rates. So I think that it's very obvious that unless we quickly vaccinate the world and achieve significant vaccination rates in every country, and the World Health Organization is aiming for 70% of each country by the end of this year, that we're likely to see more variants emerging that really threaten the whole world's progress. And I guess, it's not just whether we get a more severe variant, it's also more transmissible and more, variants that can escape the protection that's provided by vaccines. So I think we're likely to just keep seeing that happen until we actually fix this problem and fix it well.
Yep. Okay, well, I think I've got to the end of the questions. So look, we might wrap up now. I just want to say thank you to all of you who have joined today. It's great to see so many coming here to inform their vote and learn about trade in the context of the election. And of course, I want to thank our speakers, Pat Ranald, Steve Murphy, Deb Gleeson, and Matthew Rose. Thank you all so much. I thought they were really insightful presentations and discussions. And also, AFTINET, we would like to thank the organisations that are behind you guys. So that's the AMWU, the PHAA, the Australian Conservation Foundation, for their support over the years of trade justice campaigning. And a last plug for the audience, if you want to take a bit more action on this topic of trade during the election, we've got a couple things you can do. Go to our website, you'll find an email tool where you can contact your local candidates and ask them some questions about trade transparency and all of this. And you can shoot off an email straight away. We've got the scorecard. You've got the link in the chat and on the website. You can share that with your friends. If you've already seen that scorecard or sent those emails to your candidates, you can perhaps share it on social media, get the word out there. The more people who know about this important issue of trade and how it affects our recovery and how it affects how we tackle climate, the more we can build as AFTINET a case in the next term of Parliament to really confront these issues. So thank you once again, everyone, and thank you to our speakers.